Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is just one meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine the renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1, 2016, and on or before September 30th, 2017. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Harvey Epstein.
Present.
Stephen Flax.
Present.
Shayla Garcia. Sabil Rahman.
Present.
Helen Schaub is absent. Mary Sarafi.
Present.
Scott Walsh.
Present.
And Kathleen Roberts. I'm here. Let the record show that we have a quorum. Oh, Cecilia Hosa, sorry I skipped right over you. Oh my gosh. Our next meeting is scheduled for April 21st, starting at 9:30 a.m., and it is Tenant Owner Invited Group Testimony Day. Owner and tenant members should get your list of speakers to Andrew by April 19th. As stated on our schedule, speakers representing apartment owners are scheduled for the morning session, and apartment tenant representatives are scheduled to begin at 1 p.m. Hotel tenant testimony begins at 3 o'clock p.m., followed by hotel owners at 3:45. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments will be held on May 3rd at the CUNY Graduate Center, 365 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, starting at 7 p.m. There are copies of the most current 2016 meeting schedule in your folders. It can also be found on our website, nycrgb.org. Copies of our schedule here today. Please note that the public hearings and final vote meeting are being finalized and will be released to the public within the next few weeks. In your folder, you will find copies of the 2016 Price Index of Operating Costs and the 2016 Mortgage Survey Report that will be presented at today's meeting. HPD will testify at our May 26th meeting. As per the email circulated to the board members last week, please send Andrew any specific questions you have for HPD. He will make sure that HPD gets them prior to the meeting. In addition, you'll find in your folder the questions presented to DHCR from the board. It says the board, by the way. The board, who's that? In 2015, along with their responses. This document was emailed to the board on April 8th. Please review to see if there are any additional questions you would like to include this year, and let Andrew know by May 2nd. Please note that the annual Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period began on April 11th and will run through May 6, 2016. Individual packets for board members are here today. If you haven't already done so, please see Charmaine before you leave so that you can sign for your receipt of those packets. Also in your folder is a memo from COIB regarding tips for filing. I will now introduce Andrew, who will be presenting the 2016 Price Index of Operating Costs. Please note that there are copies of this report here today, and it will be made available on our website after the meeting.
Just one issue. I just found out that I have a conflict for the 14th of June, so if instead of the 14th or the 15th, if we could try to do the 15th, that would be better for my schedule. That's at all possible?
Right. I think Andrew can address that maybe later, because they've been working very hard trying to find locations, and they have some candidates, and the availability may have some influence on dates, but I hear you, the 15th is preferable for you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Oh, that was a hearty good morning. I like that. Sounds good. All right. Today I'm going to be presenting the 2016 Price Index of Operating Costs. As you know, or some of you know, we have some new members, but the PIOC gathers prices for a market basket of goods and services used in the operation and maintenance of rent-stabilized buildings in New York City, and uses these prices to estimate cost price changes from one year to the next. Changes in the overall PIOC result from changes in the prices of individual goods and services, each weighted by its relative importance as a percentage of total operating and maintenance expenditures. This is the same approach used by the CPI and other similar indices, but the PIOC specifically analyzes the goods and services typically purchased by owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized units. In order to reflect current expenditure patterns, and for the second consecutive year, RGB staff used the expenditure patterns presented in the 2016 Income and Expense Study to update the component weights for the 2016 PIOC Apartment Index. But first I'm going to give you, before I go into all the details, I'm going to give you a brief overview of our findings from the 2016 PIOC. This year, the PIOC for all rent-stabilized apartment buildings decreased by 1.2%. This is the lowest PIOC since 2002, when it was minus 1.6%, and the second lowest since its inception in 1969. Increases occurred in all PIOC components except fuel, which declined by 41.2%, and utilities, which declined 0.3%. The growth in the Consumer Price Index during the same time period was higher than the PIOC, rising 0.3%. And the core PIOC, which takes away the cost of the fuel to heat multifamily buildings and includes all other costs, the core PIOC rose by 4.2%. And the PIOC is projected to be 4.5% in 2017. So here's the overview of the changes in all the apartment PIOC, which we'll be going into detail shortly. Increases occurred in 5 of the 7 PIOC categories, or PIOC components. Notably, fuel costs declined 41.2%. Utilities declined minus 0.3%. Insurance costs increased 8.2%. And taxes increased 7.5%. More moderate increases were seen in the remaining 3 components that range from 2.7% to 3.2%. These changes in costs resulted in a total decrease of negative 1.2%. So we use PIOC uses cost weights to determine how much each one of these components, how much weight each one carries. So in the PIOC, we identify prices for various items that are representatives of the operating costs for apartment buildings in New York City. The importance of each of these items is in calculating the PIOC is its weight, what we call weight. This should be based on how much owners have spent in the past for that category of expenses. So now we use RPIE data to update those weights. So 2 years ago, an analysis concluded that the annual I&E study should be the basis of the PIOC weights. We first implemented this change in last year's PIOC. And these weights reflect actual costs reported by owners in 2014. And we ended up replacing weights that were more than 30 years old and updated based on prices changes over the years. So the original weights before that were from 1984. So it was time to update those weights. Before we take an in-depth look at the PIOC component changes, it's important to note that the data collected, the PIOC is gathered from 4 different source types: government agencies, vendors and contractors, unions and utility companies, and owners of rent-stabilized buildings. So you can see there that government agencies, we collected about 34% of the data that's in the price index. 31% came from vendors and contractors. Unions and utility companies provided us with 18% of the data, and only 16% of the data used in the price index is gathered from owners of rent-stabilized buildings. Now I'm going to outline the changes in the 7 components of the price index. The real estate tax component of the price index is the largest component and in fact represents about 26% of owners' costs. This year, taxes rose 7.5%. This slide shows a breakdown of the change of assessments and tax rate by borough. Assessed valuations of properties containing rent-stabilized units rose by 8% citywide in fiscal year 2016. Assessments rose in all 5 boroughs, with Brooklyn witnessing the highest growth at 10.3%, followed by Queens and the Bronx at 8.6%, Manhattan at 7.4%, and Staten Island at 6%. Buildings in Manhattan generally drive much of the change in the assessed valued citywide. This was true in FY 2016, with 63% of all valuations emanating from this borough. The large majority of the rent-stabilized multifamily properties are in tax class 2. There was a 0.2% increase in the class 2 tax rate from fiscal year 2015 to fiscal year 2016. As a result, the tax rate increased in each of the 5 boroughs, same percentage for all, and citywide at 0.2%. The rise in assessments and tax rate was offset by a rise in the total value of exemptions, which had the effect of lowering the total rise in taxes by 0.8%, resulting in an overall increase in taxes of 7.5%. As you can see on this graph, you can disaggregate the taxes into several components. The black line on the chart represents the change in taxes from one year to the next. This year, the change was 7.5%. The change can be broken down into the impact in assessments, which is the orange bar, and the impact of exemptions, abatements, and changes in the tax rate, which are grouped together in the green bar. The change in taxes was due to a rise in assessments of 7.5% and the tax rate of 0.2%. Exemptions dampened the rise in taxes. It is interesting to note that since 1998, the increase in real estate taxes have more often than not been driven by the rise in assessments, and since 2011, almost entirely by assessments. The price index measure of labor costs includes union and non-union salaries and benefits, in addition to Social Security and unemployment insurance. The cost of unionized labor makes up about 2/3 of the labor cost component. The entire labor cost component comprises 16.2% of the overall price index. Labor costs rose 3.2%, compared to 3.8% in the previous year. The rise in labor costs was due to increases in union and non-union wages, as well as rises in health care and pension contributions. Wages comprise 3/4 of the labor cost component. Non-union pay increased by 5.8%, 1.8 percentage points higher than the increase seen in the 2015 PIOC of 4%. Unionized wages also rose, rising by 3%, a 0.3 percentage point increase from last year. A moderate 0.7% increase in health and welfare benefits, which comprises more than 21% of the component, kept the overall increase from being higher. Now we're going to move on to the fuel component. This year there were some changes made to the PIOC fuel component. Legislation passed in 2010, which was Local Law 43, required building owners to phase out their use of number 6 oil in favor of the relatively cleaner number 2 and number 4 oil or natural gas by June 30th, 2015. As such, prices for number 6 fuel oil, although collected, were not used by staff, and the weight of this item was redistributed to the other heating items, including gas and steam. As a result of the phasing out of number 6 fuel oil, staff was interested to see the impact this has had on the cost of weights for the fuel component. So to update the PIOC, an expenditure survey for fuel costs was included in the owner survey this year. This expenditure survey revealed a shift of more weight to natural gas and less from fuel oil. However, the results of this survey were not used to reweight the expense items in the fuel costs this year, but will be incorporated in next year's PIOC. Each year, staff will try to update a different PIOC expense component via this owner survey. The fuel component comprises about 12% of this year's price index. The change in cost measured in the component considers both the change in weather and the change in prices for heating multifamily buildings by fuel oil, natural gas, steam, and electricity. This year, the fuel component declined 41.2%. The cost for heating buildings by fuel oil makes up 2/3 of this component. Fuel oil cost declined by 45.5%. Natural gas costs, which account for 29% of this component, also declined, falling 31.6%. Steam costs fell 31.2%, but these costs only account for roughly 2% of the fuel component. As stated earlier, the fuel oil cost items carry the most weight in the fuel component. This year, the cost of fuel oil declined 45.5%. As previously discussed, owners were required to phase out their use of number 6 oil to heat their buildings. Over the last 12 months, fuel oil prices, which do not take weather into account, decreased by 30.9%. The price declines per fuel oil by grade were a decline of 27.4% for number 2 oil and 38.6% for number 4 oil. This graph demonstrates that inflation-adjusted fuel prices have both risen and fallen drastically over the past 10 years. Between calendar years 2014 and 2015, prices for number 2 oil fell 28.5% in real terms, and prices for number 4 oil fell 37.1%. The average price for all grades of fuel oil in calendar year 2015 was $2.57 a gallon, which is a pure price that does not factor in weather. Adjusted for inflation, the average price in 2005 was $2.75 a gallon. Prices for both number 2 and number 4 oil are the lowest level in the past 10 years, with prices for all fuel grades 6.6% lower than 2005 and 36.2% lower than the 10-year high of $4.03 in 2008. The utilities component consists of non-heating natural gas and electricity costs, as well as water and sewer charges, and makes up 11% of this year's PIOC. This year, utilities decreased by 0.3%. Non-heating electricity costs, which account for over a quarter of the weight in this component, declined by 8.2%, while non-heating gas costs, which account for less than 1% of the utilities component, fell by 11.6%. The growth in this component was driven upwards because of an increase in water and sewer charges of 2.97%, which accounts for over 70% of this utilities component. The maintenance component includes painting and other services performed by contractors, hardware and cleaning items, such as mops and floor polish, and appliances that need periodic replacements, such as refrigerators and stoves. This component accounts for about 16.7% of this year's price index. This year, maintenance increased 2.8%. Of the 39 expense items contained in this component, just 3 items account for more than half of its expenditure weight: repainting, plumbing, faucets, and plumbing stoppage. This year, painters' rates rose 3.4%. Combined plumbing rates increased at a slower pace, rising 1.6%. Other price increases of note were boiler repair, which was nearly flat at negative 0.3%, elevator contractors up 6.7%, and roof repair up 5.9%, which these three items represent a total of 6 expense items and account for 23% of this component. Fees paid to management companies, accountants, and attorneys make up nearly the entire component for administrative costs. Following an expense survey in 2015, 2 new items, copy paper and post office boxes, were added to the component this year. And this year, administrative costs rose 2.7%. A large portion of the growth in administrative cost component can be attributed to a rise in management company fees, which rose 3.6%. And that comprises just over half of this component. Accounting fees increased this year's PIOC by 2.3%, lower than last year's rise of 3.1%. Attorney fees rose 2.4%, but 1.6 percentage points lower than last year's growth of 4%. Communications, which accounts for just 6% of the administrative cost component, decreased by 1.2%. For the 5th consecutive year, there was an increase in insurance cost component, rising 8.2% compared to last year's increase of 7.2%. Insurance costs account for about 5% of the PIOC. Changes in insurance costs for owners varied by the amount of the policy. Policies that cost more than $5,513, which represent half of all verified insurance quotes, saw an average increase cost of 8.5% upon renewal. Meanwhile, buildings with policies of $5,513 or less saw an increase of 6.8%. So we're also able to do a price index for apartments, breaking it out by pre-47 buildings, post-1946 buildings, gas-heated buildings, and oil-heated buildings. This was made possible by the 1983 expenditure study. Although the expenditure weights for all rent-stabilized buildings and for each of the 4 subcategories buildings differ, the price changes are the same for each of the 5 indices. Typically, buildings constructed before 1947 incur a lower percentage operating and maintenance costs for property taxes and labor costs than post-46 buildings, which rose 7.5% and 3.2% respectively. However, their fuel costs for heating, which decreased by 41.2%, represent a significantly higher percentage of total O&M costs. As a result, costs in pre-47 buildings fell with a PISC of negative 2.2%, while costs rose in post-1946 buildings by 0.2%. Indices were also calculated for different types of heating systems. These heating system indices differ from the price index for apartments because the expenditure weight for the fuel component differs from index to index. Buildings heated with fuel oil witnessed a decline in overall costs, resulting in an oil-heated PISC of negative 2.8%, primarily because the cost of fuel oil dropped 45.5%. Similarly, gas-heated buildings witnessed a significant decrease in natural gas costs of 31.6%, but the fuel component carries less weight in the gas-heated index than the oil-heated index. As a result, the price index for gas-heated buildings witnessed a moderate increase of 0.5%. So in addition to the apartment indices, the 2016 PIOC report also includes indices for hotels, lofts, the core, and a projected apartment index for 2017. First, I'm going to address the hotel index. The price index for all stabilized hotels declined 3.8% this year, a 3.6 percentage point drop from the 0.2% fall in 2015. It is important to note that the hotel PIOC was not reweighted using the RPIE data. However, in order to maintain symmetry between the indices, the expense items were aligned to the 7 components now used in the apartments PIOC. The realignment of the hotel expenditure items had no impact on the change in the overall PIOC and would have still been negative 3.8% if the old components were used. This year, the hotel fuel component declined 39.1% due to significant declines in the cost of fuel oil and natural gas costs used by heating hotel buildings in New York City. The fuel component accounts for nearly 20% of the entire hotel index. 5 of the remaining 6 components witnessed cost increases, with insurance having the highest rise of 8.2%, followed by taxes at 7.3%. More moderate increases were seen in labor or costs of 4.3%, maintenance 0.9%, and administrative costs of 2.2%. Costs fell in the utilities component by 2%. The hotel price index also includes separate indices for each of the 3 categories of rent-stabilized hotels, due to their dissimilar operating cost profiles, as well as the general index for all stabilized hotels. The 3 categories of hotels are traditional hotels, a multiple dwelling that has amenities such as a front desk, maid, or linen services. Rooming houses, a multiple dwelling other than a hotel with 30 or fewer sleeping rooms. And single room occupancy hotels, SROs, a multiple dwelling in which 1 or 2 persons reside separately and independently of other occupants in a single room. Among the different categories of hotels, the index for traditional hotels decreased 1.1%, rooming houses fell 4.7%, and SROs fell by the greatest proportion of 11.7%. Similar to the hotel index, the loft PIOC expenditure component weights were not reweighted using the RPIE data. However, the loft expenditure items were placed into the 7 components used in the apartment PIOC, except for attorney fees expense item, which has traditionally been its own separate expense component. Therefore, the loft index has 8 components. Because these items were not reweighted, just moved, the overall change in the loft PIOC can be compared historically to past indices. The decrease in the loft index this year was 0.3%, 0.7 percentage points lower than the 0.4% increase in 2015. Increases in costs were seen in 7 of the 8 components that make up this index. Insurance costs witnessed the highest rise, increasing 8.2%, followed by increases in taxes of 7.5%. More moderate increases were seen in utilities, 1.6%, and maintenance of 2.7%. Labor costs increased by 3.7%, administrative costs legal by 2.4%, and administrative costs other by 3.3%. These increases were offset by a decline in the fuel component of 46.3%. The core PIC, which measures long-term local trends by factoring out shifts in fuel costs for heating rent-stabilized buildings in New York City, rose 4.2% in 2016. The rise in the 2016 core was 5.4 percentage points higher than the apartment index, negative 1.2%, and 0.6 percentage points higher than last year's core of 3.6%. The core PIC rose at a higher pace than the overall PIC because fuel costs, which were not used to calculate the core, declined by 41%. Now we'll move on to the PIC projection for 2017. This slide shows an overview of the price index projections from March 2016 to March 2017. Projections for the components of the PIC are performed to provide the Rent Guidelines Board with an estimate of how much costs are expected to rise in the year following the current price index. The projection is used in the traditional commensurate formula only. It is important to note that changes in costs and prices after March 2016, the last month covered by this study, will be measured in next year's price index. Overall, the PIOC is expected to grow by 4.5% from 2016 to 2017. Costs are predicted to rise in each component, with the largest growth of 16.2% projected to be in fuel costs. Taxes, the component that carries the most weight in the index, is projected to increase 2.6%. Other projected increases include insurance, 5%, labor costs, 2.5%, maintenance, 2.3%, administrative costs projected to rise 4.9%, and utilities by 2.1%. The core PIOC is projected to rise 2.9%. So, each year, the board is obligated to formulate guidelines, and the law only gives very general criteria, i.e. the board considers mortgage financing, income expense data, tenant income and housing affordability, the price index, and other factors in setting the guidelines. Just one tool the board has used since its inception is called the commensurate rent adjustment. What the commensurate rent adjustment determines is how much would rents have to change to keep the owner of rent-stabilized building whole. In other words, if the net operating income was, say, $40 and the income was $100, how much would rents have to change to keep that NOI at $40 in absolute fixed dollars? How much would rents have to be adjusted to keep the NOI figure constant or at the same absolute number? The first commensurate method is called the net revenue approach. While this formula takes into consideration the types of leases actually signed by tenants, it does not adjust for owners' NOI for inflation. The net revenue formula is presented in two ways. First, adjusting for mixed terms, and second, adding an assumption of stabilized apartment turnover and the impact of revenue from vacancy increases. So under the net revenue formula, a guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of this year's 1.2% decrease in the PIOC is negative 1.9% for a one-year lease and 0% for a two-year lease. Using this formula and adding an assumption for the impact of vacancy increases on revenues when apartments experience turnover result in guidelines of negative 4% for a one-year lease and negative 2% for a two-year lease. For the commensurate formula included a vacancy assumption, the 10% median increase in vacancy leases calculated from the DHCR 2015 apartment registration file was used. The second commensurate method considers the mix of lease terms while adjusting NOI upward to reflect general inflation, keeping both operating and maintenance costs and NOI constant. This is commonly called the CPI-adjusted NOI formula. A guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of the 0.3% increase in the consumer price index and the 1.2% decrease in the PIOC is negative 1.7% for a one-year lease and 0% for a two-year lease. Guidelines using this formula and adding the estimated impact of vacancy increases are negative 3.75% for one-year lease and minus 2% for two-year leases. The traditional commensurate adjustment is a formula that has been in use since the inception of the Rent Guidelines Board. The traditional commensurate yields negative 0.8% for a one-year lease and 0.7% for a two-year lease. This reflects the decrease in operating costs of 1.2% found in the 2016 PIOC and the projection of 4.5% increase for 2017. So each of these formulae may be best thought of as a starting point for deliberations. The other Rent Guidelines Board annual research reports, such as the INA study and the income and expense study, and certainly testimony to the board can be used to modify the various estimates depending on these or other considerations. So, to sum up, the price index of operating costs for rent-stabilized apartment buildings fell 1.2%. excuse me. Costs in gas-heated buildings rose 0.5%, while costs in fuel-heated buildings decreased 2.8%. The core PISC, which excludes changes in fuel oil prices, natural gas, and electricity costs, is useful for analyzing inflationary trends. The core rose by 4.2% this year. Fuel costs decreased 41.2%. Taxes rose 7.5% due to the rise in assessments. Insurance costs rose 8.2%. And the utilities component decreased slightly to 0.3%. Labor costs increased by 3.2%. The maintenance component increased 2.8%. And the price index of operating costs for rent-stabilized apartment buildings is projected to increase 4.5% next year. And that is the end of the presentation. I'm sorry I have no time for questions.
Okay, questions? Go ahead, Scott.
Andrew, can you just give us a little bit more insight in how to, obviously last week we looked at the I&E, which is the RPIE statements, where we saw a PIOC of 1.7% for 2014 compared to, I think, a 5.6% in the RPIE filings of actual expenses owners incurred. How do you reconcile that year, in the context, obviously, it'll be a couple years before we see the RPIE filings for this, and as an operator of buildings, I can say unequivocally our prices did not go down 1.2%, and I can also say for all publicly traded companies who own apartments in New York City, if their prices had gone down 1.2%, it would have been in their earning calls, because most people went up 3 to 5. So I'm just having a little bit of a hard time putting together how to parse them. I mean, obviously they're different because one is price, not actual cost, but
that's the main thing. The price index is a measure of price changes and some cost where we can, whereas the RPIE data is owner-reported data of actual expenses over that time period. And that's where the big difference is. And also they take in, even when we try to adjust, you're referring to the 1.7% calculated adjustment versus the 2014 RPIE data, the 5.6. Even though we try to take, because it's a calendar year versus a 12-month period that we use from April to March essentially. Right. So when we calculate part of what may, there's certain expenses that we're including in that PIOC that yet aren't seen in the RPIE. So there's a 3-month period there, even though we adjust it, that is going to influence that low price index. So even with that, even when we do adjust, there's going to be issues. But the biggest thing is they're two different indices. One's measuring price, one is actual reported owner costs.
Right.
So, as price changes and they become more volatile, how does the owner respond to that? That's not necessarily captured in a price index.
Why would reported costs be so much higher than price?
Again, it's how, we're measuring a change of price. We're not measuring consumption. So if owners choose to buy more of something than the previous year, because prices went down, that's going to show increase in expenses on that, and maybe for whatever reason they're doing that. But you're not capturing, the number of times that someone's using that service. We may price a service, whether it's attorneys or plumbers or whatever. But if they are bringing those people to the building more because of some reason, their actual expense is going to go up. So again, it's measuring price versus actual expenditure. And those can be, vary depending on how owners, run their buildings, I guess.
Andrew, excuse me, just a follow-up. Have you ever studied, this volatile fuel number is really salient and can be a real game changer for many of us around the table. I know in 2002 you handed out a form where there was a negative PIOC in the past. Was there a volatile sort of fuel number or salient number that you sort of reconciled or compared and contrast? Because this is a huge issue, this price index versus RPI sort of actual numbers.
Right. I mean, in 2002, when the price index was negative 1.6%, fuel oil costs, because that's how we measured it back then, it was just fuel oil costs, went down 36%. So,
did you ever go back and compare?
Yeah, it may be interesting to take a look at when the price is more volatile, how does that impact RPIE data 2 years later when we look at it, right? So if we have a very volatile component, how well is that measured because it's so volatile? How does the owner, react to that, whether it's up or down? There was a 66% rise in fuel oil costs in 2003, which is the year after that big dip. Similarly, did it really, for owners, did it, because it was such a volatile price increase, how did, an owner actually react to that price? Going up or down that much. So, we could go back and take a look and see in those years, the differences between the RPIE data and the price index those years, and see if there's some sort of something we can come up with there to see if volatile prices, either way, up or down, impact our accuracy with the price index. We could do that.
I think as a follow-up to that, obviously, we don't know what the weather will be for the time period that we are projecting increases for, and it's out of our control. But it's so backward-looking, and this. We have to do the best with the data we have, but nevertheless, it is hard to predict. I just have one technical question. Does the NYSERDA degree days, does that get used?
Yeah, we use the heating degree days to see, and so we're trying to get not only price but consumption. Mm-hmm. So it was such a warmer, and we compare it to the previous year. So it was such a cold year last year and such a warm year this year. So that impacted the total fuel costs going down 41.2%. Prices were more like 30%.
Because in comparison, the 2014 NYSERDA degree days for New York City were, I think, almost the highest in a 30-year period, or one of the highest years in a 30-year period. And then last year wasn't the lowest year, but it was on the lower side.
It was on the lower side, so you get a high year and a low year, and that's going to
analytically
impact consumption.
Put them together.
And again, goes to the question of how do owners react to that consumption? Do they burn less or more heating? They burn less, but do they? Is it proportional to the drop in price? That, I guess that's part of the question.
Sabil.
Okay. Just following up on that. So the fuel component does include some proxy of consumption in terms of the heating, the weather
Correct.
aspect. Now, for the other parts of the components, what about the weighting? Is that basically what I'm trying to get at? Is there anything in here that is capturing some proxy of consumption, or Scott, you guys have some sense of how to balance the consumption against the price? So is there is the weighting of the different subcomponents capturing some aspect of consumption, either in your sense, Andrew, or in your sense, Scott? I'm trying to get a sense of reconciling those two.
I think two things to keep in mind. Obviously the city mandates the temperature which the apartments are held at, so owners are compliant with that. I think we could have a whole another conversation about legislation that's on the board, and there has been a lot of discussion about increasing the heating in the apartment. The city council has a bill that's been on the kind of conversation block for more than 6 months to increase the heating degree by, I think, 1 or 2 degrees, and it goes back and forth. I mean, part of what is hard for us to capture and what Andrew's doing is the city does also have a lot of sustainability issues, and where the heating degree increase has gotten a little kiboshed is it is in conflict with our carbon neutral policy, which I think is 2020 or 2050 for the city. So, I mean, there's a number of things that are at play. So, if the legislation would go through and the degrees would go up 2 degrees for daytime and nighttime heating requirements, again, that would be from an analytical perspective hard for us to capture in Andrew's, price index, and that would take a while, I think, to hit this price index, right? I mean, how long would it take for us to see changes in policy?
Well, I mean, since we're using RPI weights, the percentage of the expense dollar that owners use, it's that lag between the RPIE and the price index of 16 months or whatever. So there's always going to be that lag. But, eventually if that is a policy that stays in effect, and that's what that new thing is, then you would show that the proportion of the owner's expense toward fuel would increase because they're required. So it would get there, we would see it in a couple years.
But just to back up, sorry, the other part where I was trying to get a sense on, Andrew, is when you weight the different price components to get to the index, isn't that weighting built off of some understanding of consumption, or am I understanding that wrong?
No, it is. It's based on
Percentage of the total expense, right?
Yeah, it's an expenditure, right? So, yeah, it's in that sense, it's consumption.
In theory, that would that's related to some measure of actual or some proxy for expense or consumption in a sense, right? While we're waiting for the lag hard data, or am I misinterpreting that?
Yeah, no, I think within each component, there's items, we call items. So for fuel, there's item components for number 2, number 4 oil. There's 2 components for natural gas heating, depending on the size of the building, which is, again, sort of consumption because price rates are different for different building sizes when it comes to natural gas, and steam. So the components, or the items within the components are, when we do an update like we did with the owner survey, is looking at actual expense that owners did. So, we asked for a dollar figure, and that's what that is going to do. As we change, the component weight, which we'll do with the RPIE, those will adjust depending on the factor. But if, for example, if number 2 fuel oil is the most weighted item in that, it's going to remain the most weighted item, but it's going to decrease or increase depending on the component weight going up or down. So yeah, they are initially, all those item weights were initially done based on expenditure.
Have you ever looked retrospectively at how the RPIE data stacks up against the price index?
Well, we do that as part of our report every year in the RPIE. We make a comparison, and we have a chart in that report that goes back many years.
Okay.
Takes a look. Yeah, for those folks who are new on the board, we do have that graph in there that takes a look, and we compare over time. And it's never the same. Some years the price index will be higher and RPIE data will be lower, and then it will maybe switch because the time periods are different, whatever. But I think that's...
I meant looking at the same
yeah,
time
I put
periods.
the report, I didn't bring it with me, but it's in that I&E report.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you.
I have a question.
Yeah, Cecilia?
So on the survey that's sent to the owners, there are questions of like how much is being consumed by certain category.
Correct.
They have to report in that, in the survey, right?
Yeah, in the survey, so
not
normally our owner survey always collects data from owners about insurance costs,
Right.
non-union labor costs, and management fees. There's nowhere else we can go for that data. So, but that, what that provides us is a vehicle to update other parts of the price index. This year, we've chosen to do the fuel because we knew of this change of the number 6 coming out. So we need to know how does that impact the weighting of all those items within. So it's a page, an additional page, and we said, what kind of, when was your year built? How do you heat, what's the size of your building? What's the fuel that you used to heat the building, essentially? How much did it cost in 2015 to do that? And so we have all that data from the people who respond, and then from there, we adjust the weights for all the fuel because we have all that data. So, and it seems like the data is pointing to that there is going to be more emphasis on natural gas use because of that switch over from 6, someone to gas, someone to fuel oil. So we'll have to see. I haven't crunched all the numbers. It will appear as part of next year's price index. We use that data, and we use it in the following year's index. So,
Mary?
On Appendix 3, which comes our point on gas, is there any data on the gas heated in terms of the number of buildings and the year the buildings were built? What I'm trying to determine is, with the new regulations set by the Department of Buildings, buildings are 68 code, buildings are 2008 code, and now buildings are 2014 code. And with each code revision, there's been additional requirements for sustainability, as Scott had mentioned. So just to understand, since it is really the gas heated buildings that do provide an increase, can we get the data on how many buildings those are and some type of correlation on when they were built? Because even though we appreciate New York City being more sustainable, it does increase costs to the owners.
It looks.
yeah, I'm thinking, I'm not ignoring. I'm trying to think of the data source that we can use for that. It would, certainly we can get all the buildings and know when they were built. That's not an issue. It's the question of where are they registered, of what type of fuel. I know the Department of Buildings does that, but I don't know if there's, at when the requirement ends. I don't know if the size of the building matters, whether they are required to, the sustainability is for, some of those requirements are for larger buildings, am I correct about that, or is it?
It's actually for all buildings
It
now,
is for all
and there is
buildings.
some retrogrades. Even if you go in to do a boiler work, you may have to go ahead and just do a completely new energy efficient boiler.
Okay.
Change to gas. We may be able to get the data from HPD or, other city agencies, since, they have their.
Yeah, if they can give me a building list, I should be able to match it with the buildings that are stabilized and then go from there. If they have a list and they can give it, we'll find out.
That'll help.
Yeah, we would just need that portion of it. I have the rest. I just need the ones that indicate how they're heating their building.
Thank you.
Other questions? Harvey?
Yeah, I just wanted to think about your price index projections, and I'm wondering if you have the projections for compare the projections over the past years versus the actual price index that you've weighted out under the different categories. Just because I'd be interested to see your projection for last year, I think was
Right on.
so close to negative 1.2 was.
Yeah, no, it's funny.
So because I do care about the projection number of 4.5, but I want to know how real that number is in relationship to how we projected things over time, and whether that's a useful piece of data or not.
Yeah, we certainly can. We can take a look at the projections and see where they are.
Compared to what
my
the
instinct is to say that we were wrong up and down probably equally, but I'll have to see. What happened with the projection this year is fuel oil, we had a 0% increase.
But
And
also-
so if you take that out, and our core is the fuel, right? So it's 4.2. I think our projection was 4.2 last year. So we were dead on except for fuel. But that's the problem. There are a couple of components. Usually it's taxes and fuel that it's just very hard for us to predict from year to year, and that's why our projection
What's
not
the
always right.
basis for the 16.2% projected increase in fuel?
Right, we take, you know, data that projects what heating oil prices will be. We don't do it. It's a federal agency that does it. I think it's, the U.S. Energy Information Administration. It was Department of Energy. And we take that data, whatever those price, and we use, and we assume a normal weather year. We go back to normal. We always go back to normal.
And that was the same source that you used last year?
Yeah, that's the source we've been using for a long time.
Were they last year to this year?
Well, they said it would be, between with their prices and the normal weather coming. In fact, we had a zero coming out. It ended up being a decline of 41.2%. So the prices, they were off. I mean,
Most of that is
Really?
price. Most of that is they were off
what
of
did
price.
they do prices. We factor in weather. We take our methodology and put the heating degree days as part of that. So.
Yes.
And I just wanted to, kind of the understanding of the purpose of the core price index why pull out just fuel, since fuel's actually, obviously a cost that owners have every year.
Right.
Why would you pull that out as the only factor to pull out of the core, and what value is that number?
Right. I think the core, well, first of all, the CPI does a core. The CPI does the same thing. There's people interested in seeing when you take out energy costs. They don't adjust for weather or anything, but they do a separate core that's different from the regular CPI that they issue. They also do CPIs for a lot of different things. They do actually a CPI for just fuel. They look at fuel, actually not fuel, fuel oil costs. And that one for the nation was 31% down. So that's just prices, which is about what our price decline was. So we were kind of dead on with the price part of it. So the idea is you take out the most volatile numbers out of that, and you sort of see what is an inflationary trend without those volatile things. And I think what historically boards have done in the past, or some boards have done in the past, they can take a look at the core and say, okay, when you have a particularly high price index or a particularly low price index, whether there's a smoothing effect that the board will do. Instead of offering very high increases, one year the price index was nearly 17%, they clearly didn't give a 12% increase for a one-year lease. So so it was this idea of a smoothing thing. And I think that's historically where the core comes from, that, those were something that we've maintained to keep in there. And, the core is going to show a line going like this, where our price index is up here, down here, up here, up down here. So over a long period of time, maybe not from year to year, you can take a look of where, inflation is impacting prices essentially. And that was the idea behind the core.
But then why only, if there's more than just fuel that's volatile, so why only take fuel out?
Well, the fuel is the most volatile from year to year. I mean, occasionally taxes will be volatile.
Utilities are
but it's much
volatile.
more fuel related. We may have done, there was a huge tax rate increase.
Labor costs aren't volatile.
Yeah, most of the other items are
volatile.
very,
That's just not true.
are for the most part, they're not, you can't use the word volatile to describe them because they're not these huge swings in up and down.
And that's not with utilities as well? Those don't have large
No,
swings?
because generally, in terms of our index, the utilities is, most of it's paid by the tenant. So that's not something that's usually factored. It's the water and sewer rate that's impacted by that. That can be, it's been higher, now it's lower. I mean, it can be, but it doesn't end up being generally these wide, you don't get like a 40-point drop from one year to the next, or, so that's why you're taking fuel out, because that historically has just been by far the most volatile.
Yes, Steve.
And it is, I think it is of everything in the study. Fuel is one of the things that's mostly a commodity market, right? I mean, we're not buying gold, putting in buildings, or we shouldn't be. I have just a couple kind of small questions I would like to understand. When it says in the report, that the index started in 1983, many of the things are still consistent to the 1983 original study.
Well, actually, the original study was 67, I think, or 68. But then we did an expenditure study after that of owners from 1983, which was then incorporated in the 1984 going forward. Some of the items still remain, but some would, whether it's, obviously real estate taxes, but over the years we've eliminated items that don't make any sense anymore. So, and we continue to do that. We took some items out, added some, because it's just, with technology and different age, and, we're trying to update those items as we go.
So were there any items that were called or added for the current year?
Yeah,
that we should be aware
we
of?
actually got rid of, we used to price leases, documents, for example. We got rid of that this year. And obviously the number 6 is a big one we got rid of this year, because we're not going to price an item that's no longer used by owners, right? Or that we're for certain they're not being used for owners. And then we took out in that administrative costs other items recently. I think we were doing ledger paper, which is an arcane thing because of computers and things like that. So we added some other items that may be administratively use, like we put copy paper this year because that's something every owner has. And then we did PO boxes because we find a lot of owners have PO boxes, so we have the price for doing PO boxes. So we're trying to throw in these items where we can. And 2 years ago we did a whole communications item. We used to just do telephones, which was realized we had to update that. So communications now takes in internet costs, cell phone, cable, that whole thing, cable internet, whatever it is, and that's the communications. So we do throw back and we try to improve the items where we can, and we find that when we try to price this stuff, if it's no longer being able to price it, then we have an issue. We've also started, I think 3 years ago we started, or 3 or 4 years, we started taking, using the internet for pricing too, because owners certainly do that now, and we've incorporated some of that going forward as well. So, we're trying to stay current with the items that we do. It's not just everything that was from that 83. So, usually the items have very little weight, though. Something like leases, you would have to go up from, it would have had to go up 1,000,000% to even have any impact on the price. So some items are such little weight in the price index that whether they impact or not impact, it's rare that they do. So you may see over the next few years more of those items in maintenance probably disappearing a bit because they just don't impact the price index very much.
Right. And just 2 questions, thoughts on the taxes. So Department of Finance has not released the rate. Assessments are out, but rate is not out. So what assumption do you make for assigning the rate? If the rate went up, do you assign a higher rate, or you assign the same rate as the prior year? Because in general the rate is not constant.
Right,
over long periods of time.
And that's another item that we've been off projection-wise, from year to year. So, we take the tentative assessment data and we use that. The final assessment data isn't out, obviously, or the rates, right? So we do get some help with our tax projection from the Independent Budget Office. I think there's like 4 different agencies in the city that sort of do all these projections the same way. IBO is one, I know, I think Office of Management and Budget, but it's all similar formula, and they adjust the tax rate. I'm not exactly sure how they determine what the tax rate adjustment will be for each class, but that obviously can change. And I'm not sure exactly what they do there, but they do adjust the rate. What we've done over the last few years or more, and it's mentioned in the methodologies, we've taken a period of, I think it's 15 or 20 years, and we've taken our projection of taxes, and now we modify that by the average that we've been off, basically. We did that last year, and we were almost dead on with our tax. I think we said it was 7.7, it was 7.5 or something. So we incorporated it again this year. We're going to see how that is going forward with projecting taxes. So we have a factor that we adjust. We adjust by
Steve
as well.
wants to follow
Can I
up
have
on
a
this.
follow-up on that, on the real estate? Or do you, and this is really background. So I guess, how often are assessments done? And in particular, how often are assessments done in Manhattan, where 63% of the PIOC is incorporated? That skews
Yeah, I mean,
it.
all that 63% is of all the assessment revenue you're getting. You're getting most of it, more than half of it, obviously, from Manhattan, just because the values of the buildings in Manhattan. That's
Right.
simply it. Scott could better answer. Is it one every five years they assess? Is it, or is it?
How often are
How often
Class
do they
2
assess?
buildings in Manhattan assessed?
And then it's over that period that the assessment.
Whether
is-
it transitions in.
Right, it transitions.
But,
in.
it's-
I think it's a 5-year period.
It's not every 5, it's annually.
Every year, for every property.
Yeah.
Every 5 years.
And how often-
But the assessments, the formula is updated every year, but they actually go out and do assessments.
Every property, and then the question is.
That's why I just clarify, I understand kind of where you're going, but, I do think even for owners in the boroughs, the 7.7% strikes me as very low based on conversations I have with people and knowing where assessments have gone. A lot of people have double-digit assessment increases. I mean, the numbers in absolute terms may be smaller, but that still, for that owner, is very relevant,
I get it.
the
But
rate it's going up.
So the flip side is, how often does the rate change? Because it's cited
The
in
rate
here.
changes annually.
Annually. How it works is there's a rate that the whole city is allowed. It's state controlled. But what the city can do is within the 4 different tax classes, they can then adjust the rates how they want to get to that overall rate that they're allowed. So they'll go to class 2. That's why every year. This year they, in this last 12-month period, or the fiscal year 2016 tax period, they actually, the rate went up to, 0.2% for class 2. So that's how they, they decide how they want to do that going forward.
But I do think the board does need to understand that when the city is balancing the budget, it is the Class 2 property owners who, over time, have taken on more and more of the burden to balance the budget. So I think
Yeah,
you
no,
have
that's
it in
very
here.
true. It's in the
One time it
report.
was 20%, now it's up to 37.
It's like 30, it's in the report. The tax, initially, when that 4 tax class system came into effect,
Where are you?
page 5,
Yeah,
under tax levy.
yeah, 36.5.
So in 1983, when that 4 tax class system came into effect, 26.3% of the share was coming from class 2. This year you can see that the percentage was
0.5, right?
36.5%. So even though that fluctuates a little every year, it's so much more than it was in 19.
And I think it answered to the question about
83.
rate. I mean, rate over the past 15 years has been in the high 12s and into the mid 13s. It's never gone to 14, hopefully. But we're somewhat we're at a peak assessment period, ultimate high assessments and fairly high rate, even in long-term metrics.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, real estate taxes, there's no question they're,
And it's 25% of the PIOC on top of it, so.
yeah, it's by far their biggest.
So did Independent Budget Office give the 2017 guidance on, that shows I think a 2 or a 3% tax rate increase?
Well, not tax rate, but yeah, the component increase. At 2.6, I think?
2.6, which
Mm-hmm.
is definitely, would be very helpful to owners in trying to make their budgets, but I'm just curious
Yeah, no,
how that
I
was
can,
determined.
I could certainly get that.
Because
to
that
you.
struck me as a little on the low side, given where we've
Yeah, and
seen
like
things
like I
in
said,
the past 10 years.
we make an adjustment to the number that they provide for us because we found that, without the final assessment roll and without the tax, the actual tax change, so we've started to make that adjustment. So,
When do we get the final information?
the final assessment roll, I think, comes out in
It's a little, I don't think it's going
end
to
of May,
sync
beginning
up
of
with
June,
our,
I think.
it doesn't sync up with our
It doesn't sync up with the
decision.
price index, but I guess, in terms of the projection, I guess we could take a look at adjusting it. We've never done that
it would be
before.
helpful information to have when we're in the final stages of decision-making,
Okay, yeah, I want to say.
even if it doesn't result in a completely reconfigured PIOC.
Well, it wouldn't impact the PIOC, the projection is what it
The
would impact.
projection, I'm sorry, yeah.
The projection is what it would impact, so, but we could see if we can take that final assessment roll and tax rate and come up with a better projection for taxes.
Mm-hmm. Mary has another question?
Could you identify which category, if any, take into account the annual inspections, like local law 11 or elevator sprinklers? Is it under the administrative, or are we capturing it?
No, that's not something that we're capturing
Okay.
in the price index. Part of the price index is you want to try to get prices that are something that is always purchased, for the most part is always, we can't ask for everything, but then we try to get items that are, purchased the most and are consistently purchased year to year. So when there's fees that come into that, certainly we've heard testimony around that, but the fees aren't something that we've collected. Maybe in a particular year would impact the price index by increasing it a little bit, but then if they remain flat and those fees don't go up, it would be sort of like it wouldn't impact what's going on with the price index.
What do you mean by fees?
Well, I don't know, Mary can elaborate. There's a lot of different
It's
fees
even
that
more than fees, it's retaining contractors to test the sprinklers, and there's costs
Right.
allocated to that. And then there's the filing fees, which aren't that large. It's more the contractors that you need to bring in on a yearly basis and
Just to do the survey?
test out systems without your,
Well, backflow,
Yeah.
there's all kinds of.
Right, but when you say it doesn't capture local law 11, are you saying it doesn't capture, for example, the infrastructure work or exterior work that somebody has to do to comply?
the price index is usually, what we ask under maintenance is not any sort of
Capital what
Like
might
an-
be considered a capital
the
improvement?
capital improvement is not something that's captured in the price index.
But what you're saying is that this annual
That's a
cost...
maintenance, she's saying it's a maintenance, I think,
but
issue.
now with the facade, it's annual.
In other words, what you're saying is that the cost of complying with local law 11, separate and apart from doing the work that might be required, is an annual cost.
Yes, and there's several, local law 11 is just one of annual.
Well, all buildings are on a 5-year review process. So your review process is determined by your lot and block, and depending on the number of your block, determines the year you get sequenced with. So within our set of 1 million apartments, there would, without question, be 20% of them in any given year would be going through a local law 11 inspection, which is easily a 6-figure number just for the inspection, not to even have a bit of work done, but just to have the drops done on your facade, to have the modular inspection, to create the report that the city requires.
The
That as a
scaffolding.
masonry building, you are safe to the public. I guess that's a general trend for me, is just I don't know how we better capture all the administrative laws, which definitely in recent years have grown significantly. And there are a number, and I'm happy to distribute to the board, there's a lot of legislation on the table of administrative items that could become law for the period we are doing increases for. So I'll send that to people and they can take a look at it.
Yeah, and certainly we can have a discussion about, trying to incorporate or getting those expenses for folks too.
And Scott, the expenses, it does seem to make sense that the expenses would be different depending on the building type. So you have a 5-story walk-up, your local 11 expenses will be different than if you have a 100-unit building. So how do you measure those costs, and how you determine, there's, in my building, which is a 100-unit building, there's, we have a lot more expenses, and we have to do a lot more work because there's just more at risk, so they have to check the elevators and the fire detectors, which are just, there's more expenses that a small building wouldn't have.
Well, I mean, obviously, as the building has additional technological features, the curve goes with it, but
maybe that's a factor, and there's also the advantage of the economy of scale to a larger building,
Yeah.
because there's more units to be able to do that. But I'm wondering how you balance the cost versus, because we have to, not every building's the same, so the cost won't be just across the board cost, even though local 11 work might be required, it's very different.
But wouldn't that also be similar to how we're doing the costs for utilities? I mean, it's basically would be done prorated on a percentage or across the board, so there would be a fair analysis. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I spaced there. What was?
No,
I was thinking something else.
and to what Harvey's saying, it's true. There would be difference in costs depending on the building type. But
Right.
There just has to be some type of calculation to formulate the data on an overall percentage, the same way you're doing it on maintenance costs and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, short of a sort of getting owners' expenditure, I'm not sure if we can capture that without actually surveying owners about those different type of expenditures, because we need, there is the idea of building size and, and certain, obviously facade stuff for pre-47 buildings are very different for facade work, I'm sure, for post-40. Just the age of the building would have an impact. So, and since most of the housing stock is pre-47. So, yeah, no, we certainly can have a discussion about it. It wouldn't be something that I don't think we could capture this year, but again, it's, all our reports, this report, it's a basis to start a discussion around things. That's why there's testimony. That's why the group testimony day is coming up. And so if there are expenses that, we're not capturing, that certainly something presenting to the board is fine. That enhances the whole process, so.
Other questions on the price index? No, okay. So should we move to the mortgage study?
Sounds good, unless you want to take a break or something, but I think
People want 5-minute break?
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
We have to switch
whatever.
over here anyway, so.
Okay.